And today. Hi, everyone. I think you all know me. I'm Laurie Harrison. I'm the Director of Online Learning Strategies. And our feature presenter today is Graham Slatt from the library. I'll let Graham tell you a little bit more about his role. He recently assumed an acting position as the lead in scholarly communications. And I also want to thank Will Hycoop for organizing the session today. He's, as ever, on hand and making sure everything's running smoothly. The recording has started, and so I will turn it over to Graham for our presentation today on intellectual property and copyright. Over to you, Graham.
Thanks, Laurie. So today I'm going to be giving a brief presentation on intellectual property and copyright as it applies to this umbrella of projects that are associated with the VLS. Quick introduction. My regular job is the Scholarly Communications and Copyright Outreach Librarian. It's my job to conduct sessions like this across the university, engaging with the community around issues of copyright and IP. There are other positions across the small city that is U of T that also do this. So I'm the one who's in the library. So that sort of narrows my scope a little bit. For the next year, I'll be acting head of the Scholarly Communications and Copyright Office while my colleague Stephanie Orfano takes a parental leave. There are library colleagues who are around in general to assist all of your projects, and I've listed near the end of the presentation, there's a link to the list of faculty liaisons. So there are librarians who are dedicated to helping you in whatever question you may have. So that contact list will be shared. And I just want, before I get started, I just want to thank Laurie and Will for inviting me and doing a significant amount of organizational work to get these slides ready and to make sure that I was best prepared to know who's in the audience and know what your likely concerns are around these issues. So the goals for today are fairly achievable, I think. I will explain, and hopefully get you to appreciate the value of openness and open sharing and why these projects are designed and intended to be open the way that they are. We'll understand what the minimum obligation in terms of licensing and copyright are per the funding agreement with eCampus Ontario for these projects. So unlike the last round or previous rounds of eCampus projects where it came along with an expectation that a particular Creative Commons license be applied. It's different this time in that eCampus has developed its own Ontario license. So I'll explain some of the implications around that. Even with the Ontario Commons licensing, though, you still have the option and are encouraged, I would say, to also apply a broader Creative Commons license option to your projects. So I'll go into Creative Commons licensing a little bit. Then you may very likely want to use other works, third-party works to which you are not the copyright owner in your projects. And I'll describe some strategies to ensure that you're doing that appropriately and that you're planning ahead in terms of keeping track of those objects and their license terms. And even I will briefly mention fair use and fair dealing, but that's not the focus of this session. That would take a much longer session perhaps to explain all the nuances of that. But there is a resource that I've included at the end that might be helpful to you all. And then, as I said, I'll briefly describe what support is available to you in terms of copyright as you move through the work in your projects. So just a bit of context. The VLS has 3 principles, and I think this context is important to have sit next to what I'm going to talk about next. So the intent is for these projects to be collaborative, both within the projects themselves and also as part of a wider community of people working in Ontario on VLS projects, and also people working in Ontario in the broader higher education, university, and college context. Learner driven, I think you'll see that some of the conditions of their license have this in mind. And of course, they're digital by design. So I'll go into very briefly, but the Creative Commons licensing scheme, as well as the sort of Ontario Commons licensing scheme, are designed for digital objects that are going to be shared on the internet openly. So the things I'm going to talk about today are distinct from the copyright rules that you all might be familiar with as instructors, such as U of T's fair dealing guidelines, or sort of the broader national guidelines, which are, you can use a chapter, a whole work, a photograph. That's meant for within your course and your LMS, like Quarkus. The discussion is much different in an open environment. Fair dealing may still apply, but it applies in a slightly more de-scoped way, or you have to think about it a bit more carefully, because those guidelines that we've provided in order to be helpful to sort of set a baseline for fair dealing within a course, they're not really meant to apply for open courses. So why don't we just get into some very basic information. So the VLS projects are designed to be open educational resources, or OER. And OER have a bunch of definitions, but the one that you see most often is the one that was developed by UNESCO, which defines them as teaching, learning, or research materials that are in the public domain or released with an intellectual property license that allows for free use, adaptation, and distribution. So they can be copied without question. The permission is there for copying, and they may even also permit other uses like remixing, incorporating, adapting, building on, and creating derivative works from those materials. So that gives users of these materials and other educators who want to use these materials, whether just straight up or want to incorporate them into their course, quite a lot of leeway. So another way to say it gives affordances. So they're in perpetuity available for others to make use of. And so just again, these are things that are going to be open. So it's much different than things that are covered under the fair dealing guidance that the university provides. So what makes them different from other materials? So there is this concept of the 5 R's. And David Wiley, who's sort of a leading practitioner and sort of open entrepreneur, I guess you might say, has sort of defined these as the bare bones qualities that something needs to have in order for it to be an OER. So first of all, retain means that you, as the creators of these modules, of these e-texts, or whatever type of project that you're working on, keep copyright in the materials. You retain ownership. You retain the bundle of rights that copyright gives you. And it's within that bundle of rights that allows you to apply the open license that you may choose to put on your work. So if you're not the copyright owner, this is sort of the inverse of this. If you're not the copyright owner of the work, you wouldn't have the right to apply a Creative Commons license. So it is this power to retain the work that gives all that subsequent downstream licensing its force. A second one is, the ability to reuse. So that means really the ability to copy, to use that content for any purpose. As we are working in the educational space, and these are funded with a particular aim in mind, the Ontario Commons license is slightly different, that it gives these rights only to other Ontario educators, but Creative Commons licenses would apply more globally. Now the next one is where this definition gets a bit broader. Like, this is where, as a copyright owner, you are licensing a wider scope of your control over your work to others. So the OER might include the right to revise. So this means that you can take a particular part of a work and incorporate it and put it in a new context. You can use a work of someone else and put it in your work in order to illustrate something or to examine the development of a concept or something like that. And something that is licensed in this way would allow you to do these types of things freely, would allow you to, take a particular chapter in a textbook, adapt it into your particular context. Say it's a chapter about nursing in the south of the United States. You can take that content and, change the context, change the examples to Ontario-based examples. That's a very sort of basic example of something that might involve taking advantage of this right. And remix is the next one. So this allows you to sort of blend content. So you can take pieces, works, and mix them together and create something new. So it's sort of like in copyright nerdery terms, that would be like a transformative work. In more basic level, something like a course reader is a form of this. But that would be something you would provide to students. They might pay for it. It might be provided to them in a closed environment. But this right allows you to do all that stuff, mix things together in a way, and then share it openly as well. So it's a more broad license. And then redistribute this remixed work under a similar license. So it really just gives a very broad license to spread the work and redistribute this new work as long as you acknowledge the original. So those are the 5 R's, and that's kind of the ideal state of OER. In reality, just the complexities of licensing and content and where everything comes from, things get a bit more complicated, and that's why people like me exist and the other supportive people here on the call. So how open is open? So now I'm going to just go over some basics around what Creative Commons licenses actually do and what they require. So as I said, under Canadian law and under most international copyright law, upon the creation of the material, upon its, fixedness, as soon as you start typing it, as soon as you start writing it out, as long as it's fixed in a medium of any kind, that work, if it's original, gets copyright protection, and there's no need to register the work or do anything else. So that gives the owner of that work exclusive control or a monopoly over certain rights, with the exception of users' rights like fair dealing. So that sort of question of fair use or fair dealing can be quite gray. It's always there. One of the critiques of that way of using material is that there's always uncertainty. It's not predictable. It's in the eye of the beholder, or you need to know a lot of information about a particular use in order to feel that you can rely on fair use or fair dealing in every case. Or if someone else has relied on fair use or fair dealing, can you then subsequently rely on that same determination if your use is slightly different, or do you have to do it again? Do you need to hire a lawyer? Do you need to speak to someone like me? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving any legal advice. Should have said that at the beginning. So Creative Commons was developed sort of to try, on the internet at least, to provide some more certainty for both authors and users of works in terms of what they may do with things that they find very easily online. The redistributive mechanisms of the internet make sharing, copying, as we all know, very easy. So is there a way to sort of go around that fair use, fair dealing question, which is slower? And is there a way to sort of quickly, is there a way to allow authors to quickly signal what rights they are keeping and what rights they are giving up, and what rights they are happy for others to have within their scope of the things they can do with that work? So there is a spectrum of Creative Commons licenses, though. All Creative Commons licenses allow you to do the very basic thing of copying the work. So you can take it from the internet, take it from a website and put it somewhere else, whether send it to your students, host it on another server, host it on your personal website, post it in Quirkus, make it available via the site, the module that you'll be creating for your VLS project. However, they all differ in how much they allow downstream users to do things subsequent to that, to adapt remix, transform, or build upon the material, even for a commercial one. So they may allow someone to take a work and bundle it in a commercial product and sell it, or there's a Creative Commons license that prohibits that. They all also share, and I won't be talking about moral rights too much because it's a whole thorny nest that we don't have time to deal with sufficiently. They all also share the requirement for attribution. So in order to use material under Creative Commons, and when you are making something available under a Creative Commons license, there is a requirement that the work be attributed whenever it is copied or whenever something else down that downstream list of uses is done. So best practices is also to make sure that you indicate whether you've done any of that remixing, if you've changed anything significant. That's also best practice to note that. You can do this in a reasonable manner. There's an acronym, TASL, sort of title, author, source, license. That's sort of a way to do it. If you keep that in mind, is just say the title, note the author, provide the source, best if that's the link to the original, and then include the license that it was licensed under when you're reusing it. And that's a good way to also mark your own works, is the title yourself, the source, and the license. So there is a spectrum of these licenses. They sort of go from most to least open, sort of most resembling something that's in the public domain, which is free of all restrictions, to least, which is something that resembles most closely sort of the traditional copyright symbol that is applied. So the least open is the CC0, which means you're actually giving up that right to attribution. It's a public domain marking. That one, I wouldn't say is likely that any of you would be applying. It's more for things that are in the public domain already, or things that you totally just want to give up all right of attribution to. But the most common, sort of most open free cultural work license is just the CC BY, which allows for all uses as long as there's a BY, which is the attribution. There is the SA, which means anyone who uses your work downstream also has to share that work under the same license, and that can apply to any of these other variables as well. There's non-commercial, which means that if you apply this license to your work, it means other users can't make any commercial use of the work. There is also no derivatives, which means that it sort of has to stay as its unitary whole. It can't be remixed or altered in any way, and that's sort of akin to a strong preference for maintaining the moral integrity of the work. So that is something you might consider if you really want your work to stay as a whole and not give others the ability to, pejoratively muck around with it or use it for wholly different contexts and take bits and pieces of it and divide it up. So those licenses at the bottom of the spectrum, they are more like traditional copyright protection, but still they allow for the copying and sort of the movement of the work into the whole work into new contexts and say other modules or into other educational contexts in other countries or globally.
Can we take a pause there, Graham? Give you
Sure.
a chance to catch your breath, and I'm just going to open it up if anybody had any questions about this, because this is a pretty complex diagram and a lot of symbols on there, and maybe we'll just check in with the folks listening in today to see if anyone has any questions or wants to double check on what those symbols mean. Feel free at any point to put your questions in the chat. If you're having a question about something we're learning about today, someone else may have the same question. Looks like there might be a hand up.
I do see a question.
Hi, Laurie. This is me, Shafiq. Thanks, Graham. This has been really useful. I was just wondering, if we're developing a course and we'd like individual modules within the course to remain integral, is it possible for a different copyright to be attributed to to the whole course, so they can take out whatever they want from the course, but they want individual modules to remain as a whole?
So Okay, so you're asking if the whole course can have one copyright license applied to it, and then the modules might have their own
Exactly. So
different
for
marks?
example, if we wanted a module, if it were used to remain as a whole, but we don't need the entire course to remain as a whole.
Yes, I think you could apply. You just have to make that very clear in the way that you mark the modules. You could say the course is, CC by non-commercial, but then you would have to mark, and so that if there's any, if someone wanted to use the course as a whole, they could, or they could take elements of it. They could, take 5 of the modules when there are 9, for example. So it wouldn't be suggesting that you had to take the whole course as a whole, but then you could apply that sort of non-derivative to each module, if that's what you wanted to do. That gets kind of complex to explain, I think. And one thing about Creative Commons licenses is that, the organization insists that they're irrevocable. I can never say that word. So once you've applied them, you can't do a take back seize. You can't oh, actually, I've changed this. I've changed my mind. I'm going to change my license. I think in practice, as a copyright owner, you can do that. But according to the organization of Creative Commons, they don't like that, because it gets, if someone sees something in the year 2023 and they go on to do certain things with it, use it in a certain way, and then in 2025, the license is changed, that's not ideal. But as a copyright owners, I think you can change these things with proper notice, I would say. But again, I'm not a lawyer. But yes, you can do that. You can sort of mark things in ways that make it clear that they each have their own license applied to them.
Thank you.
And I see another question. If we're using a graphic image from a different source in our content, how can we find out its copyright restrictions? We do have some slides near the end that get to a certain tool that can help you find images in particular that have clear licensing metadata attached to them. So that might be helpful. But not all images and graphics will have that. And it's a very big issue. Fair use and fair dealing is there for you. And there is a recent document, is the best practices in fair use. And if they sort of adapt, they sort of go through various scenarios. One of them is like choosing images. And it's sort of like it's a thought process. It's not a rule, but it's just a way of thinking about whether or not the use of a particular image might be fair. So I encourage you to look at that, because it's actually very helpful, and it's meant for an audience like the one that we're together with today, like meant with practitioners who are looking for assistance in determining whether a particular image might be fair. See, there's a question for you, Lori.
Okay, I'll answer that one. And Helen, just hang on. We're going to get to more information about how the CC license works. So I'll let Graham carry on with the presentation, and I'll respond to Essen.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide here, because I think it answers one of the questions that's in the chat. So how to apply a Creative Commons license? The Creative Commons license is it's as simple as just affixing it somewhere to the work. It doesn't have to go in a particular place. Ideally, it would be visible or very visible, so near the beginning and near the end is, I think, what most people do. To apply a Creative Commons license, you can use this helpful tool that Creative Commons has developed called the License Chooser. So it will just take you through a variety of questions to help you think about which license might be a fit for work or for your copyright preferences. It generates the appropriate text or code that you can then copy and paste into your work. So it's quite helpful. They've recently updated it. It's sort of in beta mode, but to me it seems like it works very well. And to answer Helen's question, which I will get to, there is no, as far as I know, Laurie, there's no U of T recommended license for these projects. Under the funding agreement, there are requirements, but the funder has left it open to the grantees to decide which license they'd prefer. As Laurie says, we encourage openness, but the minimum is what the funder recommends or stipulates rather. But then you may choose a license subsequent to that you prefer of the ones that I just discussed. So does that answer everyone's questions about how do I apply the license? It's meant to be very similar to the copyright symbol. It's meant to be something in that realm that's sort of like a symbol that represents particular attitude towards rights that the copyright owner has. So instead of all rights reserved, it says, these are the rights I reserve. Here are some rights that I'm also not reserving and letting others make use of non-exclusively. So I've mentioned this a few times. What are the license requirements for VLS projects? eCampus has developed their own new Ontario, what they call the Ontario Commons license. And this is the minimum requirement for all VLS projects. This is a non-exclusive license. So what that means is that it's licensed to eCampus and the community it supports non-exclusively, so you can make other licenses on top of it. And it gives all eligible educators at Ontario post-secondary institutions the right to reproduce, reuse, and remix and adapt these works specifically for audiences of Ontario students. So it has to be for the pedagogical needs of the Ontario higher ed community. Uses beyond this community would need to occur with your permission of the licensor or the grantee. That's you. So you own the copyright. This is a non-exclusive license you're giving to the rest of Ontario, community of educators to make use of this material. So it's up to you if you want to go beyond that via Creative Commons license, for example, which is the most common open license for works of this nature. Does anyone have any other thoughts, Laurie, or questions about that?
Yeah, Graham, I'm going to ask you maybe to give a very short description of sort of the mechanics of putting a Creative Commons license on using the Creative Commons sort of website, because I think some people might not be aware of that. We'll put a link into the chat earlier on. Can you just say a couple words about not the Ontario Commons license, but the Creative Commons nuts and bolts in a way?
Sure. So how to mark your work? Is that what you're asking?
Well, or maybe I can sort of do a layman's terms. So Graham's provided this link here, which is sort of a guided process that allows you to choose the specific characteristics that he's just been describing, the various, the by, the essay that are non-commercial or share alike and so on. And once you decide on the characteristics that you want, it actually provides you with a code snippet and a symbol that you can put on your work. And when you put it on your work, it links back to that specific information. So if a user comes along, they see the symbols, and if they aren't sure what that means, they can also click on the link and it will tell them exactly how they can use your material. So that's a little bit of how the mechanics of this works with the CC.
Right, like when you include the license or the link to the license, that link will go to the Creative Commons site and it will explain in more fuller, vaguely lawyerly language what you can do and not do. So it's a direct link to the terms of the license. So it's not just a symbol, but it's also, you can explore more by clicking the license, and we'll explain the various affordances or things you can do and cannot do according to the license that you've chosen. So
Great. Thanks.
It's sufficient to include that, and then people can explore those details by clicking. And I hope that, I hope that doesn't seem too onerous. But
no, it's not difficult at all. Just wanted to make sure everybody knew that there's a couple of steps to take to set that up and then put that information back onto your materials.
Great. So what about linking to third-party content? So for the most part, linking really can't involve copyright infringement. You're not making a copy. A link is an address. So you're not actually providing a copy. You know, there are, of course, exceptions to that for in various jurisdictions that, especially Europe, there's some recent policy changes around linking. But in general, the link itself is still just an address to a resource on the internet. So by providing a link, that is a quick way, if you're concerned around copyright, to just link to something. It's not ideal though. The linked content may go away in the future. There's no way of knowing whether that stuff will stay up in perpetuity. I can never say that word either. And also there's concerns around the accessibility of that content, both in the first sense and also sort of in a disability sense, is that there's really no way to add some added accessibility features to something to which you haven't included and which you don't have control under your particular resource. So these are arguments for not relying on linking and copying and bringing something into your module. But linking is always okay. I mean, it's something that you can always do if you really need to include that content, but you're not sure if it can be included under copyright law. There's no infringing copy made with a link. So what if you aren't the copyright owner and you want to include material to which you're not the owner in your OER or in your module or in your project? This is very possible. Ideally, you find great material that you can use that is licensed under a Creative Commons license or another open license that would allow you to do this. But if it's not under that license, permission may be required. And when you're asking someone for permission, it's best practice to make it clear to when you're reaching out how the material is going to be used, and that it will, even if you're won't be able to apply a Creative Commons license to it yourself, but that it will be part of a project sort of in the context of an overall open license, so that these things, what you're really asking for is permission for these things to be made available forever within in this context. So Creative Commons, again, does offer helpful information about how to mark content for which you've gained permission, for which you've asked for permission and it's been granted. Some of this language will make sure to note that if someone is reading, someone is using your work and they come across this, that it's sort of a carve out from the rest of the work, which may be openly licensed, but this work in particular there was permission granted for this particular use, and it might not carry over into subsequent transformations of the project. There is also fair use and fair dealing, which is a tricky subject in the context of OER. Many people in the community, I think, have shied away for good reasons from recommending that fair use and fair dealing be part of this licensing conversation. Even so, in the Ontario Commons license, if you get to the very end, it says nothing in this license is meant to restrict the freedom of expression and the right of creators to make use of fair use and fair dealing in the objects that they're creating. So I would really recommend you get in touch with our office if you have any questions about incorporating third-party materials into your projects, because we want the best projects, and sometimes the best information, the most effective information pedagogically, isn't part of the Creative Commons ecosystem, because Creative Commons has only existed for less than 20 years. So there's really a whole swath of culture that exists that sort of it would be impossible for it to have Creative Commons licenses. And I don't think it would be reasonable to expect that no one be able to use any of that stuff to create, effective modules, effective pedagogical tools, So I'd encourage you to think of fair use and fair dealing. It does apply, but there are definitely some different issues to think about in these projects than within, say, your own instruction within the walls of the U of T Quercus sites and so on. So does anyone have any questions about that before I move on? Because it can be a thorny
there is
subject.
one question from Vivian. She's asking about who should be, to whom attribution should be given in the by CC, if there's a number of people involved in the creation.
That's a great question. It's good timing because at the U of T, instructors, faculty automatically own the copyright in 99% of the things that are created at U of T. It's the same for students. Students own the copyright in any of their assignments, any of the work they do through their coursework that's maybe not assignment based, but that is related to some of these projects. You might be relying on the assistance of students to develop some of the materials, even the supplementary materials, quizzes, that sort of thing. So students do own the copyright in that. So it's important that students be made aware that their work will be being used in this way. So one way of doing that is to formalize that understanding via a release form or an agreement. Student work is one example of something like this, but another might be if you're having people who aren't directly part of the project team, who would be the sort of the natural copyright owners. If you're having outside people come in and contribute, whether it's a video or whether a bit of content, it's important that those contributors also be made aware and potentially sign an agreement. A license doesn't require a signature. A full copyright transfer of ownership does. So a license can be agreed to informally, but it is, if you want to be certain, and I recommend certainty in these projects, you can distribute an agreement or a release form to your contributors, to your students, to anyone else who's working on the project, so that they understand that they may be, they can either waive these rights, or they can understand that they are seen as a contributor, but not an owner of the work. So it's important to understand where the boundaries of your copyright team is, and to get informed and to inform the others who aren't within that boundary of the terms of their participation in your project. So Samantha, who I think is on, I think I saw, has developed some amazing release forms and agreements for her particular project, and she has kindly agreed that we use those forms and develop a sort of template for these situations that we can share within the VLS community here. So expect those to be made available in the future. And thanks very much again, Samantha. That's a great contribution, and I know it's actually a very common and thorny issue with the development of these resources. So here's a slide about how to contact our office. We do have a guide for OER, which also contains sort of directories, as well as some examples of some other OER projects that the library has funded in the past, which you might be curious about. I'd also encourage you to engage with your liaison librarians. If you have questions, related to things that you find in library collections that you might want to use, I think liaison librarians would be a great resource for helping determine whether the licenses of our licensed resources might be helpful or hinder the use of those works. And please feel free to get in contact with me via this copyright at libraryutoronto.ca. We try to be quite responsive, although we've been busy this past month. Our response times have been a few days rather than a day or two. So quick tip, Google image search is very helpful, and when you're looking for images, that it has a means to only search materials that have been licensed openly, and they've recently changed the interface of this. I'm not sure if it's been improved. I'm not sure why they changed it this way, but it's still there, although in slightly different form. And thank you, Will, for updating these slides. So you go under, when you do a search, go under Tools, and then you can filter by sort of facet by usage rights, and then choose Creative Commons. In the past, you could then choose Creative Commons commercial, non-commercial, but they've sort of, I think they've sort of reduced that level of detail. You have to actually go to the actual result and click on the license details. Once there's a result on the right side of your screen, you've clicked on it and it pulls up a bigger picture of the image. You can click on the license details and it will take you to the full picture of whatever licensing restrictions. Another question, who is said to own the copyright on creative work created by U of T staff, for example, images? So by staff, do you mean educational support staff, or by staff, do you mean instructors and faculty? It's typically with the appointed staff with some exceptions. So there might be the way the exceptions might be specified in a particular contract. So if a staff are hired for a particular project, the details of that hiring might include some waiver of IP, but in general, U of T is pretty good about all staff having by default rights to the works that they create, but there are exceptions. And I feel free to get in touch with me if you're concerned about that. Development of some pedagogical tools and educational tools might sometimes be included in that, but it's best to check and make sure that you are clear on whether that you are within one of those exceptions. It's sort of a case-by-case thing that I can't answer just in general. Another tip is I'll put the link in the chat here, is as part of a other project, we developed this content tracker, which allows you to, as you go about choosing material, whether it's Creative Commons license or not, listing it here and including details of where you got it, what license it had, whether it's something that you got permission for, whether it's something that you're relying on fair dealing or fair use for. I'm getting a bit raspy, excuse me. So that is something that I think would be very useful, and it's best to be thinking about this from the beginning rather than trying to recreate this retrospectively at the end of your project. So there are quite a number of repositories or directories of Creative Commons licensed works. There are also directories of straight public domain stuff like the Internet Archive. So these are some examples, but there are more on that research guide that I posted earlier. And with that, that's the end of the content that we wanted to deliver. So there's now time for any other questions that you all might have. I hope this was clarifying rather than anxiety producing.
I think that was a great, straightforward, simple explanation, Graham. I appreciate that. But let's open it up. Does anybody have anything on your mind? Yeah, well, perhaps you could stop the recording while we have a chat. Yeah. Thank you.